such a wonderful lack of pretension. People are alive. And I don't want to romanticize poverty. It is an awful life in 1,000 different ways. But I do find over and over folks on the street have an access to God that I don't. And I want to be around that.
Brian Combs. That's whose voice you're hearing right there, and he's my guest this week on the podcast. And man, what a guest he is. As this podcast has taken a life of its own, a number of the guests have referred future guests, have recommended folks who they thought would be good to talk to. And Brian was described by last week's guest, Caroline Proctor, as one of her spiritual heroes. And that's a description which I came to understand after meeting Brian, because he is strong in the spirit, or as some people say, he is quite a character. Man, what a meeting, what a conversation we had, and you're going to hear it here in just a minute, but to introduce, he is a remarkable human being. He came to Asheville to found this Haywood Street congregation, which is a weekly worship and mission congregation that includes a free community lunch known as the Downtown Welcome Table that feeds a number of individuals in Asheville. It's open and welcome to all, as he's going to describe to you. And it's a radical organization. It is about getting your hands dirty in the ministry. He talks about concepts like low Christology and how that appealed to him, finding the Jesus in the alleyways, in the homeless shelters, in the psychiatric units, etc., the outcasts. Because if you can include the outcasts, then your table is inclusive to all. And that is definitely one of the core values of this organization. And it's so inspiring to hear him talk about it, to hear him share his inspiration for founding it and the mission of the Haywood Street congregation. It incorporates elements of community health, spiritual health, relationship health. It's about practices like empathy, inclusion, celebration of our humanity, all that means, the good and the bad, but shedding light on it and welcoming brothers and sisters to the table. It's about healing the trauma of alienation and isolation. At the Haywood Street congregation, they have a mental health respite where folks who are going through mental health crises can stay for a few nights, can get some good meals in them, and have a safe place to stay as they're making plans, getting through a difficult situation. Maybe they're homeless. Maybe they're all kinds of things. Maybe they've been victimized recently. Maybe they're just confused, lost. I think we've all been that way in our life at some capacity. And the feeling you get when you're at Haywood Street is that the church really serves those in need. Again, it was deeply inspiring getting a chance to meet Brian and to talk to him for an hour. He's got a real eccentric office with all kinds of quirky items in there, and yet we didn't really get into the quirky or the silly aspects. It was a very focused conversation. Brian shares what his vision has been for Haywood Street, and he shares how he got into the ministry, how he chose this field because it's not what he's naturally good at. The traits that are required of a pastor and a preacher are ones that caused anxiety in him. And yet he gravitated towards this as a career. He pursued it to challenge himself. That in and of itself is inspirational, but there's all kinds of inspiring stories that I felt kind of rippling out from the central story of this Haywood Street congregation and Brian as the founder of it. And it's now grown into a community, and it's much bigger than just his vision. And it's really awesome seeing our community here in Asheville come together around an organization like this. So you get to sit in on our conversation. It was one that was really enjoyable for me. I was a little anxious, I have to admit. Intimidated isn't the word, because he's a disarming personality, but I was definitely awake to his presence in the room. The guy has quite a presence about him. It's the type of feel you get when you're around a rock star or an athlete or an artist or a great teacher or leader. He's got some of those aspects and elements to the way he carries himself, and I mean that in a good way. You just feel awake when you're around him, because he has an intensity of focus and communication and belief. And so it was, again, real inspiring to get a chance to talk to him. And I hope you enjoy our conversation. This is Brian Combs. I'm not your typical preacher's office.
It's not. I'm still moving in. But,
okay.
I was across the way for 6 years, and since we've grown as a church and as a staff, we need a little more room when we meet. So I'm in transition, but space matters to me. So I'm collecting things and colors that hopefully feel pastoral.
Pastoral. That's an interesting word. What does that exactly mean? Really, pastoral? Is that?
I hope what it means is present. I hope what it means is reflective. I hope what it means is empathetic.
Okay.
I hope what it means is connecting on a most human level.
Yeah. Okay. Well, when we met in here before, I noticed that you had Lebowski
right
up here. He's around somewhere.
The dude's behind you.
Okay. Yep. And Dorothy Dix on the wall as well. Yeah.
And Yoda and the Hamburglar and it's an eclectic church.
Basketball.
A basketball. Ric Flair. The Buddha.
There's room for everyone. Huh?
Well, that's a core value here.
Yeah. Okay. How long have you been here?
This is year 6.
Okay. All right. It's Haywood Street congregation, is that
correct? We're a United Methodist mission congregation.
Okay.
Which is a little different than a constituted United Methodist or Presbyterian or Baptist church, whereas we don't take members, we don't have all the committees, we don't pay apportionments. We are a very peculiar subset of most denominational congregations. And so by mission, what it intends is that we can't support ourselves by the offering. We hope we can never do that. And that our church is primarily about being in ministry with folks who are marginalized in some way. Mm-hmm. So most of the time, churches have a mission committee. We're more like a mission that has a church committee. So.
Okay. Well, so did you come up here for this church specifically?
I did.
Okay. That was the idea. Was it already set up that way when you got here?
No, all that was here was a building. And I showed up with a calling. And when I arrived in Asheville with little more than a nudge from God to be in ministry on the streets, it was simply a listening tour of sorts, believing that of all the ways God could manifest in the world, Jesus shows up as a homeless man, hangs out in the red light district in the psych ward. And so if my role is to ultimately encounter the living Christ among us, then I'm going to have to go to all those same places. And so in doing that, what I heard back overwhelmingly was what formed the very beginning of this church. One is worship should be participatory, place of radical welcome. 2 is if you're going to do food, don't do a soup kitchen. make it a family meal where there's plenty of room at the table, where folks feel loved. And then also make church be a place where I can bring my brokenness every bit as much as my beauty, rather than beginning with the assumption that I have to have on my Sunday best, or that church is the place where we masquerade as if everything's fine. So that's where we began. And this building is a former United Methodist church that had closed and was simply being rented out to nonprofits. And so that's where the partnership with Central United Methodist, that still owns this building, began. They were looking to really incarnate downtown and what it means to welcome all that is downtown Asheville, but didn't know how to do it. And then I came along with this peculiar calling, and they said, let's make this work together. So,
all right.
So here we are 6 years later.
Yeah. This is intense right from the get-go, just imagining this journey that you're on. Yeah. And let's take it back a little bit in your personal life, how you got to this point. Help me understand kind of how you arrived here.
Perhaps what was most formative for me was watching my dad put on his suit every morning and go work at the community mental health clinic. And so this notion of service, this idea of faith, is a lived out witness among folks who are most marginalized, who are suffering. That was modeled for me every day of my life. And I remember my dad's pager going off at 3 a.m, and he had to go to the emergency room for some kind of psychiatric care. And so the notion that folks in poverty and or with mental illness were to be feared or considered with suspicion was completely foreign for me. It was one of the places where I felt most at home, mainly because I saw my dad do this all day, every day. And so I think without question, the core values that have formed this ministry were really imbued to me every day I saw my dad get up and go to work. In addition to that, I come from a family. My dad is Scotch, Irish, German, Dutch. My mom is Mexican, Indian, and Spanish. And so that is an amalgamation of races and ethnicities that creates an ambiguity in me. And early on, based on what my peers said to me, what are you? Who are you? You're not quite white. You're not quite black. I got a very clear experience of what it feels like not to fit in. And so the more I grew in my faith and the more exposed I got to the Gospels, the more I saw Jesus prioritizing those folks who didn't fit. And so that's another formative piece for how we do things here. Folks that have been excluded, told they're not good enough, told they're not wanted for whatever reason, sexuality, skin color, creed, economic class, disability. Those are the folks we have said that's who we want to be in church with. Not in spite of, but because of.
So one of the big principles for you is the notion of inclusion, opening the table to everyone having a place at the table.
Absolutely. And if you look at the earliest new church document there is, it's the book of Acts. And the early Christians are there filled with the Holy Spirit. They've been spilled out onto the streets of Jerusalem, and they're not sure what to do. They had been locked in an upper room, scared, unsure of everything they had learned from Jesus. And over and again, as you read through the book of Acts, the early Christians are faced with a choice. Do we welcome women? Yes. Do we welcome Gentiles, even though we're Jews? Yes. Do we welcome the uncircumcised? Yes. Do we welcome eunuchs, folks who were castrated and from a different part of the world? Yes. And in my opinion, every time the church widened the table and pulled in extra chairs to sit at the heavenly banquet, the church grew, the church became more faithful. And so it's not any more complicated than that for us.
Well, the way you describe it sounds very simple.
It is. We're not doing anything new here. There's nothing novel. In fact, it's a curious conversation to have with folks that come, and I'm thrilled that they're touched and moved by the ministry. But when they say, "What is it that you figured out here that's different?" I say this is as old as United Methodism, which started on the streets of London among the poor, and even older than that is certainly the gospel of Jesus doing the same. So
for you, growing up, did you grow up in the church? Was that a part of your upbringing?
Yeah, Sharon United Methodist in Charlotte. I was baptized in Charlotte. I went to Sunday school, went to worship every week, went to youth group, went on the mission trips. I was confirmed. So the church has been a parent of sorts for me. Additionally, in the summers, I would come up here to the mountains, and as a camper, I would go to a place called Camp Toccoa, and then when I came of age, I worked there, ran the kitchen, and so church has always been a part of who I am, what has influenced me, where I've run in social circles, and certainly that's where my call to ministry began, in the church and at camp.
Okay, so you grew up in Charlotte, and in the church, in the Methodist church, and this, like you said, it imbued this sense of values for you, maybe, or a sense of belonging, a sense of place and purpose.
Yeah, I'd begin with belonging, whereas in public school, where I got to go to school with kids from India and Vietnam and from the projects and from the mansions of Charlotte, all mixed up in a wonderfully integrated school system.
What school did you go to?
I went to Montclair Elementary, I went to Smith Junior High, and then I went to Olympic for high school. So,
okay. Charlotte public schools.
All public schools. Yeah. That was an important ethic for my parents. And
your dad was a psychologist, you think?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Mom was a banker, and as I alluded to earlier, throughout my education, as wonderfully integrated and diverse as it was, I still never quite fit a box there. And so, whereas I was asked routinely, "What are you?" At church, I was asked what my name was. I was asked, would you like to sit at the table? Do you want to participate? And so church became the place where I felt most authentically me, where I felt an innate sense of belonging, where I was not alien or other, but rather I was just Brian. And so that was incredibly powerful for me.
Okay. So this is the upbringing in Charlotte, growing up in the church, a sense of belonging and comfort, felt like a good place to invest your energy and to feel that sense of belonging. What happened after high school? Did you go to college? Or?
Went to college, went to NC State, majored in design and religion, and was very clear that of all the things I may be called to do in ministry, preaching was not one of them, nor is someone with learning disabilities and struggles with public speaking, reading and writing would be preaching and the administrative tasks that are such a part of the life of the church. And yet, here I am doing all of those things. And so that's part of how I know it's a calling. This is not necessarily a natural aptitude.
Interesting. So did you have a learning disability? Did you...
It's been difficult to pin down exactly what that is, but I went through the battery of tests and had a number of accommodations in seminary. In undergrad, I did not. But I had an awareness of this starting in third grade, and I got A's and B's. So I think for parents and teachers, it was just study a little harder, and that's all it is. But for me, I knew there was some difference in the way I processed information, and that sitting at a desk and listening to a lecture was not the way in which I needed to learn best.
Well, that's interesting, because it sounds like, if you were marked as having a learning disability or just a different process, then you get seen that way, maybe by your teachers or maybe by other students, and maybe you think of yourself that way, or maybe not. But, that makes sense how inclusion is going to be such a part of it if you're cast as an outsider, really by anybody,
Yeah, I had an asterisk by my name, two of them, really. One about, this is a bright student, but could be achieving at a much higher level. And then two, what is your ultimate identity? Because we as a society can't quite name it. And so I think, for me, through a lot of pain and struggle, that developed a certain sensitivity to those same folks who were silently in a classroom suffering for whatever reason.
Our sensitivities, when we get kind of marked for those or selected for those or selected against because of those, it can be our greatest strength, and also how we get picked on or excluded, and then it becomes a source of our character. our particular sensitivities. And, now in the modern era, a lot of them get labeled as mental illness, and
Right.
there's issues related to that. But that's interesting that you were tuned into that from an early age and it shaped you. But you said that when you were in college, you knew that preaching was not your calling.
Right.
What did you mean by that?
Meaning that most of us don't move towards our places of greatest discomfort and dislocation. That's not the tendency that our DNA pulls towards. And again, that's what I mean by calling. I think for most of us, we take a standardized test or some kind of values assessment or skills, and whatever we score highest on is usually what we gravitate towards. And yet for me, it was, here's my greatest place of insecurity and weakness. And yet over and over, I'm convinced this is where God is calling me. And the piece of the story that I haven't added is, as convicted as I was about not being in a extroverted public role, I dismissed that as long as I could. So I went and worked as a designer for a while. Loved that. But ultimately knew I would end up in the church somehow.
Okay.
So I'm a reluctant preacher, a reluctant pastor. And for many colleagues in ministry, that's their story as well. So
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So you worked as a designer for a while. Yeah. How long did you do that?
I did that for 3 years and found myself thinking back to church camp and mopping floors and taking out the trash and buttering biscuits for kids, running the kitchen, and that sense of altruism, that sense of cause, of purpose, just simply was so remarkably formative in my life. And when I put that in comparison to ideation drawings or working in the shop or meeting with a client about how to make another product more beautiful, but ultimately won't matter a bit to the betterment of the world and more to so much of the intention of my own design career was how do we encourage consumerism and materialism. I just thought it's pretty clear I need to go back to where I'm most deeply called. And
Was it something that was kind of scratching at the back of your mind, like that you felt like this calling or being drawn to the ministry?
It was always there. I remember sitting at my design desk and thinking I enjoy my life and I could make a decent salary and get married and have a family, and in 10 years I'll need to quit my job, uproot my family, and go to seminary. So I can either do it now or create an awful lot of heartache in a decade. So I'm single. I have an awful lot of flexibility in my life. Why not move towards what I already know is my deepest truth? And to get there, quit my design job, hiked the Appalachian Trail, spent that time in the woods.
Oh, wow.
And just to be clear.
The whole thing?
Did the whole thing.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
When was that?
2001, 7 months of solitude in the woods. It was my monastic experience of sorts, and nature is such a remarkable teacher. It offers you lessons in silence over and over again that can't be taught anywhere else. So that's what I needed. I just got quiet and wanted to make sure that small, still voice in me that I believe we all have, that I would call God or the nudge of the Holy Spirit, I just wanted to listen to it. So.
Did you hike it by yourself?
I did.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
As I've heard stories from folks who've hiked the Appalachian Trail before, did you have a trail name? Or?
Yeah, 3/4 time. It's
3/4 time. All
it's
right.
out of a song. It's if most of the world runs at 4/4 time, I'm at a different beat. So.
Okay.
Also, I took 7 months. Most folks are a lot faster than that, so I tried to go intentionally slow.
What was that like?
This is one of the best things I've ever done. In fact, I remember finishing up in November, needed to get some Christmas presents. I went to the mall after 7 months of no showers, going to sleep with the sun going down, the rhythms of nature and the seasons, and being simply overwhelmed by the perfume department and the industrial lighting and the drone of of suburban life. It was very startling to me. And in some ways, still is.
Mm-hmm. But you came back from the AT, and is that when you went into seminary?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. Went to Emory in Atlanta, and at that point, I thought nothing can trump the experience of the trail, but seminary was even more transformative. So,
how so? What opened up for you?
Well, primarily, I got introduced to the Jesus, as I mentioned earlier, that have tried to follow here in Asheville. Whereas Jesus in Charlotte was European and pleasant and amiable in so many ways, the Jesus I got introduced to in seminary was black. He was full of low Christology, meaning that he was a very human Jesus rather than a divine one. His feet very much touched the ground, and he incarnated in the dregs of life. And that if you wanted to experience him, again, you've got to go down to the labor pool. You've got to go to the homeless shelter. You've got to see where the prostitutes are congregating.
Mm-hmm. Man, this is some powerful stuff here, Getting in touch with the spirit of the living Jesus.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And you found that spirit lived in the outcasts.
I did, and this is not an idea unique to me.
Right.
To give perhaps an extreme example, much of the argument in seminaries is, again, around Christology, and perhaps the most famous articulation of this is Karl Barth. And Barth is one of the genius theologians of the world, and he had a very high Christology. And what I found was that Jesus was so perfect, he was so divine, that the distance between he and I was such a chasm that I actually couldn't follow him. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, Christianity is not so much about worshiping God, but following God. Whereas Howard Thurman, who was Martin Luther King Jr.'s chaplain at Boston University, offered a very low Christology in saying, Jesus stood in line, Jesus got hungry, Jesus wept, Jesus touched people, Jesus sat at table. Can you do all those things? Well, all of us can. And so if that's ultimately what discipleship is about, is being human in the ways that Jesus taught, well, then Christianity just got redefined in a way for me that was a revelation of sorts.
I really like the way that you put this, because as I'm listening to this and imagining your experience with it, it sounds to me like if you were able to pursue that spirit through human interaction and continue to dive into the human aspects, the struggles and the difficulties, the being excluded and all that, then you can feel like you're on the right track with following Jesus. It's the way it sounds.
Absolutely. And in no way is that to forsake the mystery of God that ultimately is unknowable. Mm-hmm. Or the divinity of Jesus. He spun miracles, and he had a foresight and a intuition about the world that, in my opinion, has never been seen before or since. And yet, here we are on the dawn of Thanksgiving and Christmas, and ultimately what most of us are going to celebrate is this baby who was born in a manger. But for me, the power of incarnation is that God is going to take up residence in flesh and blood for the cause of intimacy with us, to be vulnerable. Buechner has this wonderful quote, "How absurd is it that God would come to us in diapers?" And so if God is willing to go to any cost to be in relationship with us, then here we are practicing Christianity by sitting down and having a conversation, by breaking bread together, by walking the streets or breathing the same air. That was the epiphany of seminary for me.
Simple.
Sure.
Powerful. Well, this is, I enjoy listening to this experience and this story, because I can feel the draw. I can feel how you're committed to this and how you believe in it and how you've made a practice of this. And it's inspiring to hear you talk about it, just the edges of the story here. But let's pick it up maybe with coming up here to Asheville, in this stage of your journey. Because what I'm hearing is you felt this spirit in you, and you felt, like this is going to work. If I just continue to go for the human,
right,
the human element, which is always going to be underneath, and you can find it anywhere. then I'm doing God's work, or I'm filling my purpose. And then you make it through seminary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And did you come directly up here to Asheville? Or?
Did a year at Grady Hospital. It's the big indigent hospital of the Southeast, right downtown Atlanta, and was the chaplain on the in the emergency room Friday nights, which was a remarkable experience. I had the psychiatric ward. I had the neonatal unit with the kids whose moms were addicted, and I had the infectious disease floor. So all the folks who you had to put on caps and gowns, gloves and masks to go sit with in their dying days of AIDS. And it was easily the most holy experience I've ever had, because here's the insight. For many people, the assumption is ministers are motivated by altruism, and there's some truth to that. However, if you talk with helpers, caregivers, professionals like you and I long enough, ultimately what they'll confess is, I'm here for selfish reasons, and that is because I get to have a front row seat on the most intimate, vulnerable moments in life with people. And when that happens, God always shows up for it. So really why I'm here is because I want to encounter the holy. That's really why I'm here. And in my experience, the holy is most palatable in the places of greatest angst, greatest pain, greatest crucifixion. And that was Grady for me. And for fellow chaplains that have had a chance to be in that incredible institution, the experience is regularly the same.
That's tough, though. It's tough work, being around that.
It's tough work if you begin with the assumption that I'm here to help.
Okay.
If you begin with the assumption that I'm here to fix. If you instead begin with the assumption that my role is simply to show up and be present and to experience God, well, then all of a sudden it becomes as critical as breathing or eating. It's a life-giving force that when you're away from it, actually you feel anything but alive. And that has been my experience with urban ministry since. What's hardest for me is when I'm away from it.
What does it feel like then?
The gift of, and anybody can relate to this, the gift of sitting with someone who is struggling is there is a clarity of word, there is a purpose of action, and there is an immediacy of God that folks have. And so when I'm not around those things, then it's more like the experience I described at going to the mall after the Appalachian Trail. I'm inundated with all of the gloss and paraphernalia of fool's gold, in a sense. And it's shiny and it's beautiful, but we all know it's just a veneer. And yet it's so seductive. And so I find myself number in those settings, whereas on the streets, there's such a wonderful lack of pretension. People are alive. And I don't want to romanticize poverty. It's not my intent at all. It is an awful life in 1,000 different ways. And but I do find over and over folks on the street have an access to God that I don't. And I want to be around that.
Wow. That's powerful. I hear a lot of humility coming through this and championing the humility, It's tough for me to put it into words.
If we begin with the assumption that the pastor's role is to model Jesus, that the pastor is the one most saved, that the pastor is the one with the direct line to God, then all of a sudden you create a pastor-centric church of sorts, and that can so easily breed a hubris, which is always close to any of us who do this work. At the same time, if you flip that, which is our intention at least here, to say, Brian is actually not the pastor. It's the Jesus and the holy other who we're here to look for. I'm not here to be Jesus, but rather to welcome him. Well, then that changes the whole hierarchy. And it intentionally undermines any sense of paternalistic evangelism. That is, the person of privilege, of access, I'm saved, and that the person who's poor or demented or psychotic is not saved. Well, we're flipping that and saying Jesus over and over again prioritizes the disinherited. So let's go there and wait for him to show up.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's always in front of you, then you can't help but maintain a posture of this isn't about me.
Mm-hmm. So what was it about Asheville that brought you up here?
You talk to pagans, you talk to folks who are secularist, you talk to New Age folks, you talk to Christians. There is a resonance about this place. And as a young child in the back of my parents' 1980 white Valiant, when we would drive here, I just knew I was home.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps it's the wisdom of these mountains embrace. Perhaps it's the giant crystal people say is underneath Pritchard Park. I don't really know, nor do I need to know, but it's right. And I've traveled the world over and again, but my heart just simply is at ease here in a way it's not other places.
What a great description. It captures the feel.
It's something that you feel, and regularly, as I'm sure you're aware, you hear of these folks from different places of the world. They come here to vacation, and they don't go home.
Yeah.
They had no intention of moving or selling their home or leaving their jobs, but this place captivates their soul in such a way that they simply can't leave. Yeah. It's John Denver's line, I came home to a place I'd never been before, and so here I am, and I don't want to be anywhere else.
All right. It's home.
It's home.
Yeah. So when you got here and you got to this church and this particular mission that you brought, basically the vision.
I would certainly say I co-partner with God.
Okay.
It was with the Spirit's leading and God's direction, but
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you've been doing this 6 years here, you said, and there's been write-ups in the paper, and you've really stimulated the community here, and you've made connections in the community, and now this is an established thing that you've got. Has it been difficult to build it, or what's it been like?
Yeah, the first 2 years were arduous. They were austere and difficult. It was very difficult, and before the praise and the adulation, which has been so appreciated, there was no salary, there was no money, there was no worship, there was no welcome table. It was simply me. So yeah, it was tough.
Mm-hmm. In the early going.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
Especially that first year.
And now you've got some partners in the community who see your vision and have seen it kind of become the great thing that it is now.
I think it was unexplainable verbally.
Okay.
And so it wasn't until worship began, the welcome table began, the bohemian blend of all kinds of people coming together. It wasn't until that happened and people could come over and get it on their skin and breathe it that it started to make sense. It was simply too absurd of a calling, of a vision to, again, describe with a PowerPoint presentation. You just had to get here. And once people did, then all of a sudden it started to make sense.
Okay.
That's where conversion started to happen.
Okay. And let's talk about for just a bit here at least, kind of what it is that Haywood Street congregation, what you offer to the community and where the service is.
Let me start with what we don't offer. The misconception at times, and understandably, is that we're here to feed people, we're here to clothe people, okay. We're here to help the homeless. That's not why we're here at all.
Okay.
Homeward Bound, the Rescue Mission, Salvation Army, many of the nonprofits in town, they do that work so well. They're social service agencies by and large. We are a church, however. Okay. And so a church has a different set of agendas. For example, I'm regularly asked how many people have gotten housing, how many people have gotten sober, how many people have gotten sane because of Haywood Street, and I have no idea. That's not a primary question for me. It's an important one, I think, for the social work community, but for us, it's who experienced God. Did people feel like there was place at the table for them? Was it family?
How do you measure that?
You can't. That's the thing. I can't write it down. I can't put it on a form. And when grantors want measurable outcomes for funding, I can't give that to them.
Uh-huh.
And so back to why it was difficult at the beginning, that's yet another reason. We weren't trying to create a commodity that could be transacted in the circles of poverty. We were simply intending to be, from a utilitarian level, useless.
Intending to be useless.
Yeah, we're intending to be useless. And so...
What does that mean?
It means that the very best things in life are almost always transcended by definition. What we are doing right now, in a sense, is intentionally useless. It's the best definition I've ever heard of art. Art is useless, and yet art is perhaps one of the most critical things in the world. It nourishes us in a way that we cannot completely comprehend, and yet we show up at the museum and we stare at the painting and we put sculptures on our public squares because it matters. And so church is supposed to be the purveyors of the same things. Forgiveness, relationship, reconciliation, salvation, intimacy. All of these things matter to the soul, but they can't be measured with a pencil.
Yeah. As we're using language to try to put this into words and maybe failing at times, or perhaps always failing, but what the sense that I'm getting is that you're comfortable with maybe a concept like paradox or, intentionally useless. You can't put it into good words or it's going to sound like the opposite or, but it seems like you're comfortable with inhabiting that space.
Yeah, in fact, our motto here is holy chaos.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, yeah.
Those are two words that don't go together.
Right.
And so, James Fowler, who's a brilliant United Methodist theologian who just passed away last week, he wrote a book called Stages of Faith that is the seminal work in psychology of religion. And basically, he just traces the maturation of faith. And at the top, in his opinion, the mystics all were able to embrace ambiguity. How can we follow a Jesus who dies to give us life? How can black and white come together? How can two things that seem diametrically opposed to one another be in concert with one another and in fact enhance the truth of each other? And that's the very best of the life of faith. And so we try to practice that in every way we can. And one of the ways we do it is simply by blurring all the lines, forsaking all the stereotypes, and trying to get to a baseline of experience again that simply can't be measured.
In the work that you do here, you work a lot with folks who are diagnosed with mental illness.
Right.
We've talked just a little bit about that before we met here. And can you tell me about what that experience is like for you? Were you drawn to these individuals, or are they just the ones showing up? But what's that like for you?
It's important to know that more people on both sides of my family live with mental illness than don't.
Okay.
And so bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, multiple personality disorders, chronic depression, anxiety, these are simply the traits of loved family members. And so any sense of life without mental illness perhaps doesn't make sense to me. In fact, there's a picture that I showed you last time of the great figures of history, Virginia Woolf, Abraham Lincoln, among others, Beethoven, that have lived with mental illness. And so while it brings a level of suffering into the world that is undeniable, it also can reveal something about the human spirit that I don't think the sane can. And so as I named earlier, if Jesus has shown up among the disinherited, and there's a wonderful story in the gospel of Jesus beginning to claim his prophetic voice and his mother, Mary, and his brothers coming to a place where he was inhabiting a conversation. And the gist of the story is they want to have him involuntarily committed. They think he's insane. If that's the priority of the gospel, and in my own experience, folks who are mentally ill are the great revelators, then why would I not court people of the same ilk? And so routinely in our worship service, someone has a psychotic break. The ACT team, they were here Wednesday The ambulances routinely show up to take people to the psychiatric ward. And again, we are so honored that the majority of folks who are considered the hardest to house, who occupy the Copestone psychiatric unit, who have been institutionalized, are here daily. Because again, in my opinion, they are the God bearers among us. Doesn't mean it isn't incredibly messy, full of all kinds of difficulty and strife, but I do think there's an insight into the divine that the sane simply aren't able to access.
I really appreciate your approach like that. It's definitely inspirational as a psychiatrist, and I like the inclusivity of it, of course, but it really just gives a sense of purpose to the struggle that many folks who are diagnosed with mental illness go through. It helps to clarify in words that the struggle is not in vain, that there's a purpose to it all.
And that so often the conversation is around pathology, and yet in my reading of the Gospels, it should be on potential.
Yeah.
And so perhaps this is a moment to reframe even our language. Is it really a mental illness? Perhaps you could reframe it as a gift of the Spirit in some settings. And so we intend in every way to try to be open to that possibility every day we're here.
Yeah. Well, that's, again, inspirational work that you're doing, and I appreciate the way that you articulate that, because it helps me to understand approaches for describing these situations, or to understand these situations as people are describing them to me. And I think there's a lot of great room for real empathy in the description that you use as you're approaching people there. I'm sure there are struggles and difficulties in working with this population. And you guys have set up a respite here. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that some. I'm very interested in this, and I think our listeners will be too.
We have a congregant named Angel, and Angel was homeless for quite a few years here in Asheville, and she had been in and out of the hospital with a variety of complications, primarily around breathing. And she showed up Wednesday after Wednesday for church carrying her oxygen tank. And she was toting this thing all over town. And she had an inability to catch her breath after worship, called the ambulance. This happened a series of times. In conjunction with that, we learned about the respite model that at that point was only in eastern North Carolina. And it's a very simple premise, and that is if you're homeless, you're perhaps might have a primary care doctor, but more than likely you're going to go to the emergency room if you've got an ailment. Anything from a common cold to getting hit by a car to debilitating chronic cancer. And so on the hospital side, they certainly have a requirement to treat people, insurance or not. And so they are likely going to stabilize those folks as quickly as they can and discharge them with a care plan. It's very expensive for the hospital to see people in the ER. And so regrettably, what happens is whatever the care plan is can't be followed under a bridge. It can't be followed if you are worried about a trespassing ticket from the police. It can't be followed if you have to shuffle from agency to agency the way folks in Asheville and every other city do in order to meet your most basic needs to survive. And so whatever the ailment was, even if you had a temporary reprieve at the hospital, never heals. So you go back to the hospital. And you do this incessantly. And so where respite comes in is you can be referred from the hospital side if it's a physical ailment. You can be referred from the psychiatric unit. You can be referred from a same-day surgery center. You can be referred from a detox center to come and stay with us. Yeah. We don't think of ourselves as a shelter because providing a bed is not primary to what we're trying to do. However, we have an 8-bed facility. We have a nursing staff. You get 3 or 18 meals a day, however much you want to eat. It's a renovated Sunday school wing of our church. So there are bedrooms. There's a living room with recliners and a flat screen TV. There's a kitchen. There's 2 bathrooms. And as important as medication compliance, which happens at respite, as important as follow-up visits are, which happens at respite, as important as rest is, which happens at respite, far and away, in my opinion, what is most therapeutic is sense of family. And that is what I hear person after person say to me is, what I needed more than anything else was for someone to know my name, for someone to ask me how my day was, for someone to say, let's share a meal together, and for someone to pray with me. That ultimately, in conjunction, again, with all those other factors, that's why I'm doing better. That's why I feel a sense of wholeness. That's why I've healed. And it's been very profound for us to see here.
Yeah. Do you run into challenges? Are you overused, or do people take advantage of you?
I think one of the biggest challenges is grace is scandalous, in the sense that it is one of the most subversive acts we can do in America, especially in a culture that says everything must be fair. Tough love is the way you must respond to the poor. And when folks come in contact with Haywood Street, where we say, you can come early, you can stay late, you're not required to go to worship, there are no rules and regulations of sort, there is no 10 commandment of behavior, we're just glad you're here. That's dislocating to the nervous system in 1,000 different ways.
Yeah.
And routinely what we see people do is act out in response to that kind of care, which is entirely understandable.
Yeah.
It's entirely understandable. What do you mean when you say you love me and you mean it? Well, I have 50 years of life experience that tells me I should not trust that. What do you mean that my stay here is unconditional, that I can't get banned? Well, I've got an awful lot of experience on the streets that tell me the exact opposite. So you just go down the line. Yeah. And so that remains a very curious challenge to continue showing up for people in a way that's consistent, that invites them to consider perhaps the world can operate, at least in this place, this Christian place, in a different way.
I think it's wonderful what you're doing, and I'm interested in it from many different perspectives, but just kind of like analyzing it. You know, what I see a lot is a history of human behavior, that where there are rules, people push up to the rules.
Sure.
Human nature. And, you know, where there are limitations, people are going to push up against those. And it's interesting, the notion, and I don't know all that y'all do, but to offer an unconditionality to the services. And then where do you push up against that? Where do you resist? And where do you, then you're taking that away as like, we're not going to just introduce ideas that you're going to push up against. Right. We're going to come literally with open arms, and then, it is dislocating to the nervous system. I like the way you put that. And then you're able to get past that disorientation, dislocation, and there's so much more room for real empathy there. That's a really great approach to caring for people.
We begin with two assumptions. One is we trust you. And so much of life in poverty is we don't trust you. So therefore, we're going to assign a number to you. We're going to track how many resources in this town you've used. If you're over your limit, you can't get anything today. Also, we're going to inundate you with all kinds of rules and regulations about why you can and can't be here. If it's a shelter, for example. The other thing we try to do is begin from a place of choice. And I'm often amazed as the weather gets cooler why so many folks refuse to stay in a shelter system and instead will risk hypothermia camping on frigid snow-filled nights. And what I hear overwhelmingly people say is to be human is to have choice. I need some sense of autonomy over my destiny, about when I go to the bathroom, when I get up. And so as much as possible in respite, and even more so at Haywood Street in the church environment, trust, choice. Those are huge. Now, again, we're trying to do intentional community in a closed environment in respite. There are boundaries that we have to stake somewhere. And when folks bump up against them, we obviously have to have a conversation. It's not a free-for-all. But at the same time, we don't begin by showing people the policy manual.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that can be a really great model for the healthcare industry to learn from. I think it's different. It's very different, but I think those principles, we could learn a lot from that.
And let me say, Dana, this is not my own doing. This is, again, back to the beginning premise of Haywood Street. My role is to be listener in chief. And so by lending an ear to the stories of the street, again, what I heard was, regardless of what agency I'm navigating, there is an assumption of guilt when I arrive, that I have done something wrong. All right, well, then let's begin from a place of trust, if that's what you're saying you need. If you also say, I have no sense of decision-making in the outcome in which I'm bound up in, well, then let's give you choice. So, again, I'm doing everything I can to be led by the voice of Jesus among those who are most silenced.
What kinds of challenges are y'all facing now, 6 years into it, having grown to this point of being established? Where's the future for Haywood Street?
Well, the immediate future is we're going to add a Sunday night service.
Okay.
And so many folks have come to us over the past 6 years and said, I've got a domestic violence support group, or I've got an RHA psych appointment, or there's something pressing, I'm trying to get a job, and that happens an awful lot on Wednesdays. So the Sunday night service will be an attempt to, again, respond to what folks have asked for on the street. So it's been curious to see, even though folks will say Haywood Street is my church, there is a reverence for worship on Sunday that feels different than Wednesday for a lot of people. And so,
right, yeah.
So we'll do Sunday night worship. In addition, we'll have a dinner as well. And so there are so many offerings of food in this town. There are less on the weekends. And again, our primary aim here is not to feed or clothe people. However, I'm thrilled secondarily if folks can get a good meal too. So Sunday night dinner and a worship service. In addition to that, we're very curious about a fresco project. There's an artist in town named Chris Holt that has some wonderful ideas about doing an art installation here at Haywood Street. So that's a possibility. And then the third is housing on campus. We would love to be a part of taking the diversity, the blend, the integration of the worship service and turning that into an actual community. Respite is a microcosm of that, but folks are only there for a few weeks, few months at a time. Permanent housing, however, would be a natural step for us to take. And so I'm really curious about privileged and unprivileged, sane and insane, sober and intoxicated folks saying, we want to do community together, not just on Wednesday, not just on Sunday night, but all the time. And so what would it look like if we built a structure of some kind right here in our parking lot?
Wow, that would be something. It sounds to me like there's very much an idea that there's an organic quality to the work y'all do here, which is, just to continue to meet the needs as they arise, and they're going to change, and continue to work towards the needs without expecting that you can measure it very easily in a quantifiable way, not expecting it to be completed. Your work's not going to be done in a day or a year. Does it get discouraging ever? I mean, I guess that's where faith comes in, but...
Well, let me say, in the same way that Jesus was a unscrupulous businessman of sorts, he paid an equal wage for unequal work. He was an indiscriminate sower. He threw seeds on rocky and fertile soil alike. We are probably less than ideal when it comes to long-range planning and having a very tight sense of where we're going. We certainly have some inclinations, but ultimately the Spirit's guidance may or may not go in that direction. And so part of my responsibility is to say, here's what the pulse of the church is. Here's really where we're feeling most deeply called. And we may or may not have considered that. And so I just named 3 possibilities. We're putting an awful lot of time and work into those happening, and they may be completely undone for something else. I have no idea. And so there is a wonderful freedom in that also, that despite my best efforts, this is not a human endeavor ultimately. So in terms of challenges, struggles, we never intended to be this big. Routinely, there's 500 people here on a Wednesday.
Wow.
We saw ourselves initially, and still do, as a small church. And so those numbers are dramatic. And currently I'm the only clergy person on staff. And so those are some daunting numbers. And if ultimately relationship, presence, listening is what we care about most, I simply can't do that with 500 people. And so I do think something is inherently being lost in how we're trying to do ministry as we grow. And so I'm not sure how to respond to that. I'm another challenge, and again, these are growing pains, perhaps more than places of angst. But Haywood Street has resonated with folks who already have church communities in other places, for folks who are housed, and we were intended initially, again, for those who've been most marginalized. So especially during the summer, we will routinely see an influx of 50 to 100 people from youth groups who have come to Haywood Street from different cities, different states, because they are moved by this. And yet their presence in some ways displaces the very reason why we started this to begin with. And so I don't quite know how to respond to that faithfully, but
does it ever surprise you here?
Yeah, I think I have to be a steward of the surprises, because they come in so many wonderful ways and unexpected. This whole thing is a surprise. Again, back to long range planning. We didn't intend any of this, and so I'm quick to deflect credit as if a few of us sat down and plotted this out. That was not the case at all.
Yeah. Okay. Anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to talk about or that you wanted to share with our listeners about yourself or Haywood Street?
Be thrilled if you took the time to listen to this, and there is something so far past words about this place that I can only say come. Experience it yourself and make the invitation. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. You've invited me to a Wednesday service, and I'm planning on attending, and I'm looking forward to it. So thank you.
Daniel, for 6 years, I have said unequivocally the most important thing that anybody can do for Haywood Street is share the story of this place, and you've done that. So thank you.
Thank you for taking the time with me today, and thank you for sharing Haywood Street's story with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, bless you. Thank you.
So there it is. That's my conversation with the Reverend Brian Combs. Wow. What an individual. Thank you, Brian, so much for joining me and sharing in conversation with me for that hour. It was very inspiring to me, and I'm really glad to be able to share with others what you shared. And so 2015 has now come to an end, and 2016 is here. What a great way to start 2016 than with this conversation. So here in 2016, follow the podcast. Drop me a line, send me an email, anecdotalevidence@danieljohnsonmd.com. If you want to be a guest on the podcast, send me an email. Get a hold of me. Got some exciting guests on the horizon here, so you're going to want to stay tuned. This has been quite a ride already, and it's going to continue into this year. I'm really excited about it. Check us out on YouTube, Anecdotal Evidence. Of course, we're on iTunes, and we're at danieljohnsonmd.com. So happy New Year, everybody. Look forward to sharing it with you. Till next time, this is Daniel Johnson, MD. Take care.